Sarah Martinez stared at her reflection in the gleaming windows of the neuroscience laboratory where she'd spent the last 5 years of her life. Another late night, another set of inconclusive results. As a researcher studying neuroplasticity, she understood better than most how the brain could change, yet her own patterns felt frustratingly fixed. The soft hum of laboratory equipment provided a familiar backdrop as she gathered her things, her mind drifting to the anxiety that had become her constant companion. Despite her professional success, something felt missing. The experiments, the papers, the endless pursuit of grants, it all seemed to lead nowhere meaningful. Outside, the sprawling university campus stretched before her, its modern architecture, a stark contrast to the ancient landscapes she'd been reading about lately. Her grandmother's old Bible, rediscovered during a recent move, lay in her bag like a gentle weight against her side. Its pages held stories from a different time, a different world, yet somehow they called to her with an urgency she couldn't explain. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, not unlike the dusty paths of first-century Palestine she'd been imagining. How different that world must have been, she thought, from her sterile laboratory with its precision instruments and carefully controlled conditions. Yet perhaps the human heart hadn't changed so much after all. Her phone buzzed with another notification, another deadline, another demand. Like so many of her colleagues, Sarah felt caught in an endless cycle of productivity and performance. The irony wasn't lost on her. While she studied the brain's capacity for change, her own life seemed stuck in patterns as rigid as the neural pathways she mapped in her research. The message came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Dr. Chen, her mentor and friend, had forwarded an invitation to an unusual conference, Neuroscience and Ancient Wisdom, Bridging Millennia. The keynote topic caught her eye immediately: the neuroscience of transformation, ancient parables and modern brain science. Sarah's finger hovered over the delete button. She had enough on her plate already, but something about the title resonated with her recent late-night readings. The parable of the Sower had particularly captured her imagination, its imagery of seeds and soils surprisingly relevant to her work on neural pathways and behavioral change. The same principles of neuroplasticity that we study, Dr. Chen had written in his note, might have been understood intuitively by ancient wisdom teachers. Sometimes the oldest stories contain the deepest truths. The conference promised to explore how ancient agricultural metaphors might illuminate modern understanding of human transformation. It was a far cry from her usual academic conferences, but as she read through the program, Sarah felt an unexpected stirring of excitement. Or was it fear? "This isn't real science," Sarah muttered, closing her laptop with more force than necessary. 3 days had passed since Dr. Chen's invitation, and she'd found herself repeatedly returning to the conference website, drawn to its promise of bridging ancient wisdom and modern research. Her latest experiment results glowed on the screen. Behind her, graphs and data points that should have commanded her full attention. Instead, her mind kept wandering to the parable she'd read the night before. A sower, different types of soil, seeds that either flourished or failed. The metaphor nagged at her scientist's mind, challenging her carefully constructed worldview. Correlation doesn't equal causation, she reminded herself, falling back on the mantra of her training. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. Her research on neuroplasticity showed how the brain could change. Through repeated patterns and focused attention. Wasn't that exactly what the parable suggested about spiritual growth? The rational part of her brain, the part that had earned her PhD and countless accolades, insisted this was a dangerous deviation from her career path. Mixing science with spirituality? It could be professional suicide. Besides, she had Grant, Deadlines looming and papers to publish. Dr. Elena Rodriguez wasn't what Sarah expected. The renowned neuroscientist who had devoted her career to studying contemplative practices had none of the stern academician's typical demeanor. Instead, her eyes sparkled with warmth as she welcomed Sarah to her office. "You know," Elena began, gesturing to the brain scans decorating her walls, "these images tell us something remarkable about human potential for change. But they're not so different from what Jesus taught in the parable of the sower." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "I don't see the connection." Eleanor smiled, pulling up a series of fMRI scans on her computer. "Look at these neural pathways. See how they're strengthened through repetition and weakened through neglect. Now consider the parable's 4 soils. The path where seeds can't take root, like neural pathways hardened by rigid thinking. The rocky ground where growth is superficial, like temporary neural changes without deep reinforcement. The thorny ground where competing priorities create chaos, like scattered neural networks without focused attention. And the good soil?" Sarah found herself asking. "Ah," Elena's eyes lit up. "That's where sustainable transformation happens. In neuroscience terms, it's where we see lasting neural reorganization, new pathways formed and strengthened through consistent practice and attention. The ancient wisdom and modern science tell the same story. Transformation is possible, but it requires the right conditions and dedicated cultivation." The conference center buzzed with an energy Sarah hadn't expected. Scientists, theologians, and practitioners of various spiritual traditions mingled freely, their conversations creating an intellectual symphony that both thrilled and unnerved. Dr. Chen's keynote presentation blended seamlessly between neuroscience data and ancient agricultural wisdom. "The sower's practice of scattering seed liberally," he explained, "mirrors what we now know about neuroplasticity. Change requires repeated exposure, multiple attempts, and persistent effort." Sarah found herself taking notes with increasing enthusiasm. The parallels were undeniable: the brain's need for repetition and reinforcement, the importance of environmental factors, the role of focused attention in creating new neural pathways. It all aligned with the parable's wisdom about spiritual growth. During the break, she found herself drawn to a workshop on ecological spirituality. The presenter, an environmental scientist turned spiritual director, spoke about sustainable practices in both agriculture and personal growth. "Just as modern farming has rediscovered the importance of soil health," she explained, "we're rediscovering the ancient wisdom about cultivating the soil of our hearts." Something shifted in Sarah's understanding. This wasn't about abandoning science for spirituality. It was about recognizing the profound harmony between ancient wisdom and modern discovery. She pulled out her phone and, with slightly trembling fingers, registered for the full conference series. The following weeks tested Sarah's resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her laboratory colleagues raised eyebrows at the new books on her desk. Neuroscience journals now shared space with works on contemplative practices and agricultural wisdom. Dr. Peterson, the department head, had been particularly pointed in. His criticism, "I hope you're not letting this spiritual interest interfere with your real work." But Sarah was discovering allies too. Dr. Chen introduced her to a growing network of researchers studying the neuroscience of meditation and spiritual practices. Dr. Rodriguez became a regular mentor, helping her design experiments that bridged her previous work with her emerging interests. The greatest challenges, however, came from within. Old thought patterns, what the parable called thorns, threatened to choke her newfound inspiration. Grant deadlines loomed, publication pressures mounted. The voice of academic skepticism, so deeply ingrained, questioned every step toward integration. "Your brain is literally rewiring itself," Dr. Rodriguez reminded her during a particularly difficult week. Look at these scans of long-term meditators. The same principles apply to any sustained spiritual practice. The thorns in the parable, they're like competing neural networks, demanding our attention, disrupting new growth. Sarah found unexpected support in a graduate student, Michael, who shared her interest in the intersection of science and spirituality. Together, they began gathering data on the neurological effects of contemplative practices, documenting the brain's remarkable capacity for transformation when given the right conditions. As winter settled over the campus, Sarah faced her greatest challenge yet. Her thesis proposal for a new research direction, studying the neurological basis of spiritual transformation, was met with strong resistance from the department committee. This is too far outside our scope, one professor argued. It's not measurable, not quantifiable. But Sarah was prepared. She presented her preliminary data, brain scans showing structural changes in consistent practitioners of meditation, studies on neuroplasticity in response to focused spiritual practices, and the striking parallels between agricultural principles and neural development. The ancient Sower knew something we're only now rediscovering, she explained to the committee. The condition of the soil, or in our case the brain, determines the potential for growth. We've seen how trauma hardens neural pathways, like a well-worn path, how shallow engagement creates temporary changes like rocky soil, and how scattered attention prevents deep growth like thorny ground. In her office later that evening, Sarah stared at the parable again. She realized she wasn't just studying transformation, she was living it. Her own soil was being cultivated, challenging years of purely materialistic thinking while maintaining scientific rigor. The crisis came unexpectedly. A major journal rejected her latest paper, a study combining neuroscience with contemplative practice, with scathing reviews. The same week, she learned her funding might not be renewed if she continued her current research direction. Sarah found herself in her lab late one night, facing what the parable called the rocky soil of her own heart. It was one thing to study transformation. It was another to persist when everything seemed to be falling apart. Dr. Rodriguez found her there, surrounded by scattered papers and failed experiments. You know, Elena said quietly, every great paradigm shift in science faced similar resistance. What you're experiencing, this crisis of integration, it's actually a sign of growth. She pulled up Sarah's latest brain scans. Look here. When we face challenges, when old patterns are disrupted, there's often a period of chaos before new, stronger neural pathways emerge. The parable calls it the testing of the soil. We call it neurological reorganization. Different languages, same truth. That night marked a turning point. Sarah realized that true transformation, whether of the brain, heart, or spirit, requires passing through periods of disruption. The seed must break open before it can grow. Spring arrived with unexpected validation. Sarah's controversial research began generating interest beyond traditional academic circles. A prestigious interdisciplinary journal accepted her paper on neuroplasticity and ancient wisdom, a quantitative analysis of transformative practices. The data was compelling. Participants in her study who engaged in regular contemplative practices showed measurable changes in brain structure and function. Areas associated with attention, emotional regulation, and empathy showed significant development, similar to what agricultural experts would call soil enrichment. What we're seeing, Sarah explained at a departmental presentation, is the brain's remarkable capacity for sustainable transformation when given the right conditions. Just as good soil requires proper pH levels, nutrients, and microbial activity, the brain requires consistent practice, supportive environment, and meaningful engagement. Dr. Peterson, who had been her strongest critic, now sat in the front row, nodding thoughtfully. The evidence was hard to ignore. Participants who approached spiritual practices with both dedication and understanding showed the most significant neural changes. It wasn't just about behavior modification. It was about fundamental transformation at the cellular level. More surprising were the ecological parallels. Just as sustainable agriculture emphasized the interconnectedness of soil health, water, systems, and biodiversity, Sarah's research revealed how spiritual growth involved the integration of thought patterns, emotional responses, and behavioral choices. The parable's wisdom about good soil found striking validation in both neuroscience and ecological principles. Integrating her discoveries into daily life presented new challenges. Sarah found herself navigating between the structured world of academic research and the more fluid realm of spiritual growth. Her laboratory now included both traditional experiments and innovative studies on contemplative practices. She developed what she called the Sustainable Transformation Protocol, combining insights from neuroscience, ecological principles, and ancient wisdom. The protocol emphasized three key elements. First, consistent practice, like the regular and tending of soil to strengthen neural pathways supporting spiritual growth. Second, environmental awareness, recognizing how relationships, habits, and daily choices either nurture or hinder development. Third, patient cultivation, understanding that lasting change, like healthy agriculture, requires time and careful attention. The parable, she often reminded her students, wasn't just about different types of soil. It was about the process of cultivation. We're learning that the brain, like soil, can be rehabilitated with proper care and understanding. The transformation in Sarah's own life became impossible to ignore. Her research achievements now stemmed from a deeper place, not just ambitious striving, but genuine desire for understanding and service. The good soil she studied had become a reality in her own heart. Colleagues noticed the change. Where competitive stress once dominated, they found a calm presence. Her laboratory became known not just for rigorous science, but for integrative wisdom. Graduate students sought her out, drawn by her unique ability to bridge multiple disciplines. The paradigm shift she championed began gaining wider acceptance. Other researchers started exploring similar intersections between ancient wisdom and modern science. A new field was emerging, one that honored both empirical research and timeless truth. More importantly, the principles she discovered were being applied beyond academia. Hospitals began incorporating contemplative practices into treatment protocols. Schools experimented with mindfulness programs based on her research. The ancient wisdom of the sower found new expression in contemporary life. 1 year after that first conference invitation, Sarah stood at a podium facing a different audience. The parable of the sower, she began, wasn't just a story about agriculture or spirituality. It was a profound insight into the nature of human transformation, one that modern science is only beginning to fully appreciate. She shared not just her research findings, but her personal journey. The evidence was clear. Transformation was possible, measurable, and sustainable when approached with understanding and dedication. The ancient wisdom about preparing the soil found striking parallels in neuroscience, ecology, and psychology. We stand at a unique moment, she concluded, where science and spirituality converge to offer hope for genuine change. The sower's secret wasn't just about where seeds fell. It was about the possibility of cultivating any soil into fertile ground for growth. As she looked out at the eager faces before her, Sarah knew she had found her true calling, helping others discover the art and science of heart transformation. The journey that began with an unexpected invitation had become a mission to bridge. worlds, and cultivate new possibilities for human flourishing.